This is the first part in a series about the Unraid file sharing system. As this is a large topic, it's going to be broken down into a few videos. This first one is going to be looking at Windows and Samba or SMB shares. The video will be looking at some of the problems that can be experienced and solutions that goes with it, plus just some general tips. Sounds interesting? Then let's get started. Hi there guys, so we have our Unraid server all set up and we want to use it as the NAS on our network to store all of our data. So after we set up some shares, how do we access our data across the network from another PC? Are there any best practices? What are the common problems that people might experience? And how do we protect certain shares from being able to be accessed? Well, in this video, we're going to take a look at Unraid and its shares, permissions and how to access them. We're going to be looking at some of the pitfalls and problems that you can have when trying to set up the shares and the solutions to overcome these problems. And we're going to be looking at this from a Windows PC, from a Mac OS system, on which we'll also be looking at how to create a time machine share and also using and accessing shares on Linux systems. But before we start with part 1, let's step on over onto my test server and have a little introduction on setting up some basic shares on Unraid. Now the first thing we're going to look at, we're not going to look on the shares here, we're going to go to settings and we can see the various network services that we can use. And we've got 3 different types of file shares here. We've got SMB, which is the standard Windows file sharing, NFS for Linux and AFP for Mac, although nowadays it's much better on Mac to use SMB. Now by default, Unraid already has SMB enabled. But NFS isn't enabled, so if you want to use NFS on your server, you'd have to enable that here. And also the same for AFP. I'm not going to enable AFP myself because I really don't see there's any point. And so now with SMB and NFS enabled, let's go across to our shares. Now I haven't created any custom shares on this server as yet. These are just the default ones which are created when we install the system. And by default, none of these shares are accessible over the network. Let's have a look at app data here. If I scroll down, here we've got the security settings for the type of shares that we can make. So here's the NFS security settings, and we can see here the export is set to no, so that means app data is not shareable over NFS. And for SMB, also export is set to no. So shares with export set to no are not visible over the network. And this is the default for the automatically created shares on Unraid. So let's set up a new share. So I'm going to click onto add share here and I'm going to call the share media and you can put in a comment. So let's say for the comment, I don't know, myplex media files. Now all of the settings below here I'm going to leave as default while setting up this share. Because this video is focused on the access of shares over the network, I'm not going to go over these settings in this video. But if you want to see what these settings here do, then please see my video about that here. Okay, so now let's click on the button Add Share to add the share to Unraid. Now we can see here the media share we've just added. Under SMB we can see it's set to public by default. So let's go back to the share here and have a look at its settings. So we can see by default on Unraid when we add a new share, export's automatically set to yes and the security for the share is set to public. However, by default NFS security, export is set to no. We're going to come back to these settings later on, but for now let's just click onto done and let's try accessing this media share through a Windows computer and see if we can see it. So let's open Windows File Explorer and I'm going to click onto network and look for the server. For the moment it tells me network discovery is turned off, so let's change that and turn it on. And now here's the Windows computer I'm on and this is the server that we just set the share up on. So if I click onto that, we can see here's the media share and here's the flash drive. And the reason we can see the flash drive here is because by default that's actually shared over the network. Now if you didn't want the flash drive shareable over the network because you're worried people may come and delete files here by mistake or maybe on purpose, then we just go back to the Unraid web UI. Make sure we're on the main tab here. Go down to where it says flash, and we can also see an exclamation mark here that tells us the flash drive is set as a public share. And so here where it says SMB security settings, we can change this from export yes to export no, and click apply and done. So now if we minimize this page, refreshing here now, we can see only the media share is available. Okay, so it seems quite easy to better browse the network and see our Unraid server, but this isn't always the case. Let's close this window and I'll show you what happens when it all goes wrong. Now sometimes when we go to File Explorer and click on Network, well, I can see my MB server here and I can see my pfSense router, but I can't see anything else. So why can't I see it? What is the difference? Well, I think it was after the creators update of Windows 10. On new installs, Windows disabled SMB1 by default. Now we need SMB1 to be able to browse the network. And the reason Microsoft disabled SMB1 by default was in an attempt to try and stop the spread of the WannaCry virus happening quite as much as it was. Because SMB1 is really old and not really very secure. So what we can do if we want to re-enable it is go to the control panel and then Programs and Features, and then go to Turn Windows Features on or off, and then scroll down, and here we need to tick SMB 1.0 and click OK. And now we're going to have to reboot the PC for these changes to take effect. And now with that enabled, we're able to go to the network, and then we can see all of the devices that are there. So there's the server we set up the media share on, and these two are two other Unraid servers on the network as well. Now if you don't want to enable SMB 1.0, then you don't have to be able to connect to the various shares on Unraid. You only have to have it enabled if on Windows you want to be able to go to the network and browse the various devices that may be there. The best way in Windows to connect to a share is to map a drive to it. Now before we map the network drive, we must know the name of the server or its IP address. So let's go back to the Unraid web UI, and I'm going to go to Settings here and Identification, and here we can see the name of this server. Mine's just called Backup Server. Now by default, when you do a fresh install of Unraid, the server name is always Tower, but I've changed mine here and that's why mine's different. And we can also see our IP address of the server by going to Settings, then Network Settings, and here I can see the IP address of this server. Now it's important that your Unraid server always has the same IP address. So you can either set a static IP address and define it manually here, or you can have an automatic IP address and have your router give the same IP to the server each time through address reservation, because you don't really want your Unraid server's IP address to change on reboots. Okay, so we know the name of the server and its IP address. So now back on Windows, let's go to this PC and then click Map Network Drive, and here we can choose the drive letter, and now for the folder we need to type //. Now we can either put the name of the server here. I personally prefer to use an IP address because I think it's more reliable, so I'm going to pop in the IP address of the server, which for me is 10.10.20.197, and then another /, and then the name of the share, which was media, and then we can click on to finish. Okay, and so it says the folder's empty, so I'm going to copy some media into here. Okay, so now I've copied the 3 Back to the Future movies in here. So because I've managed to copy some files into here, I've obviously got read and write permissions in this share. And now we're going to look at the permissions again. So let's go to Shares and go to Media, then I'm going to scroll down and look at the SMB security settings here. So export is set to yes, so this is now shared over SMB. And security is set to public. So when it's set to public, anyone can view the share, read the share and write to the share. So what happens if we want to add a share which we want to be private? We don't want everyone to be able to access it. So let's add another share now, and this one I'm going to call Secret. So let's open the share and look at its share permissions. So I want it to be shared, so I want export yes, but I don't want it to be public. So the other two options I've got is secure and private. So if I had it on the secure setting here and clicked apply, having it as secure, guests will only be able to read the files but not write or delete anything. So let's click on to done here, and we can see here under SMB it tells us that this share is secure. So let's minimize this and click on this PC, and now let's map a share to this drive. So again we're going to do exactly the same, but this time instead of media we're going to connect to the share named secret. And here we are inside of the share. Now you can see here that earlier I put a file in here already, and we can actually open this as we have read access on this share. But if we try and delete it, it's going to tell us that we don't have permission to perform this action. And also if we wanted to create a new folder in here, we also wouldn't be able to do that either. So as this share is meant to be secret, maybe we don't want to have guests or anonymous users be able to access it at all. So let's go back to the Unraid server and go back to our share, and now change the security from secure over to private and click apply. So now let's go back to Windows. So now I'm going to click on the share secret, and it's telling me that I don't have permission to access this share. So that's good, that's what we expected, but we can still access the media share here as it's a public share without any problem. Okay, so here's where it starts to get slightly complicated. I actually want to be able to access this share here, but I don't want to change it to public. So what I'm going to have to do is to add my Windows username and password to Unraid. So let's go back to Unraid and go to users, and by default we only have the root user set up. So I'm going to have to add my name here, and so I'm going to pop in Ed and my password, which is just Unraid, and click add, and done. So what I've done is I've put in my Windows username and the password I used to log in, and so you'd think now I'd be able to access that share. But of course things aren't always as easy as they seem. So let's minimize this and click onto secret, and it still says that we can't connect, but I can connect to the media share fine. So let's try removing this. Let's click onto disconnect and add it again, and you'd think this time we'll definitely be able to connect. So here's the share secret, and I'm going to click on to add, and it's asking for my Windows credentials. So you think, why is it doing that? Anyway, let's pop them in and click OK, and we still can't connect. And you can see the error here says the network folder specified is currently mapped using a different username and password. Okay, so let's stop here for a moment and I'll explain to you how accessing shares on Windows works. So here's my Windows computer, and its username is Ed and the password is Unraid. And here's my server with two shares, one's a public share and the other a private share. So let's say on the computer I connect to the public share. So what happens behind the scenes is Windows makes a request to be able to connect to the share, and then the server asks who's making this request, and then Windows will reply with its username and password. Now the server checks to see if the username and password is in its list. If it isn't in its list, it lets it connect to the share because it's a public share, and it connects it in as a guest with the username of nobody. And also Windows seems to connect to the share with the username of nobody even if its username and password is in the list on the server. However, there's one little quirk to note, and that is if the client has a username that's in the list on the server but the password is incorrect, then the server actually won't let it connect to the public share at all, not even as the username of nobody. And we'll see an example of that a bit later on. But right now, let's look what happens when a Windows client logs into the public share. So let's go onto the Unraid server, and you see under users here, I've just created a user called Ed with the password of Unraid, and that matches what I've got on the Windows box. So if we go and open a terminal window, and this is on the Unraid server, and we type SMB status, we can see here the identification of who is connected to which share, and at the moment there's nothing connected. So now I'm going to browse the network and connect to the public share here, the media one, and we're in, and now we'll run the command again, and we can see here it's logged in as a guest because it's logged in with the user nobody. So because Windows is connected to this public share, it's logged in as a guest and not with its own username and password. So it works fine connecting to public shares, that's no problem at all. But we do run into a bit of a problem if we try and connect to a private share after having first logged into a public share. So my Windows box isn't logged into the public share with the username and password of Ed and Unraid, it's logged in as a guest user. So now let's say I add the private share to the server, so now you'd think that I should be able to access that private share from the Windows box. But here's what happens. Because I'm already logged into the public share as an anonymous guest user, Windows stupidly, in my opinion, won't allow us to connect to the same server with a different username. So it tries to connect again as a guest to the private share, and obviously it gets rejected. So let's look what we can do to fix this. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to disconnect this network drive, and I'm just going to log out and then just log back in. And that's just to make sure there's no connections at all to the server. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to do a search here for credentials and go to Credential Manager and click on Windows Credentials here, and then I'm going to click on Add Windows Credential. And now I'm going to put in the IP address of my Unraid server, which is 10.10.20.197, and the username I'm going to put in as Ed, and the password Unraid. And that's because I've created this username on the Unraid server, but I could use any username and password on the Unraid server that has permission to access the shares, and I'm just going to click OK. And so what this is going to do is every single time that this Windows box logs into that server, it will use the username and password that we just specified, and so therefore it will never log into a public share again as that nobody guest user. Okay, so let's look at that in action. Let's go back to Terminal in the Unraid Web UI, and then let's go to this PC and then map the network drive, that same public share, the media one that we had mapped before. And here we are now back in that share. So now let's go across to the terminal window, and again let's type in SMB status. So there we are, great. I'm now logged into this public share with the username of Ed. So now it's actually logging in with the proper username I want it to, no longer using the nobody, no longer using the guest user. So now I can map the private drive as well, and because the user on the Unraid server Ed has access to this drive, when I click on finish, I get straight into that network share, and plus I've got full read and write access because the user I set up does. And now because we're using Windows Credential Manager to log into the server, Windows isn't trying to log in as a guest and as a named user. So this means Windows can log into any public share, but also it can log into private shares so long as its username has been specified on the Unraid server and those permissions put across to the share that we want it to be able to access. So that's how we fix that weird Windows problem of being able to log into a public share and a private share at the same time. Now to look at the next problem, I'm going to go across onto my other Windows machine. Now on this machine I've got the same username set up here, but actually the password is different than what it was on the other machine. So even though I've got the username of Ed set up on the Unraid server, the password is different on the Unraid server to what it is on this Windows box. So now let's see what happens when I try and log in to a public share. So again I'm going to try and map a network share across over to the server into the public share that's called media. And you can see now that even though this is a public share, it's asking for my username and password. And that's because when the Unraid server has asked this Windows box who it is, Windows has replied that its username is Ed, and that username is in the Unraid server's list of users, but the password doesn't match, so it doesn't log it in to the public share. And if we go back to the Unraid server and we actually delete this user here, now when we try and map the network drive again, we'll go straight in, because there's no conflicting username and password that's on the Unraid server. Now there's a similar problem that can occur if you have some saved Windows credentials that are incorrect. So let's look at that happening. Let's disconnect this network share now, and I'm just going to go back to the Unraid Web UI to the users list, and I'm going to pick a user here, this one here called Kuma, and now I'm going to open up the Windows Credential Manager. And now for logging into the server, I'm going to use the username of Kuma, and I'm just going to put a totally incorrect password here. And so now with these details stored in the Credential Manager, I'm going to try and map that same network drive again. And you can see here I can't log in and it's asking for the password for Kuma, and that's because the password stored in the Windows Credential Manager is incorrect. So if you have trouble logging into a public share and it's asking for a username and password, then go to the Windows Credential Manager and delete any saved credentials that might be there for your server. And then you should be good to go and you'll be able to map across to that network drive and log into that share. Okay, so while we're talking about mapping Windows network drives, I just want to quickly talk about another problem that we can experience when using them. And that is, when you map a network drive, it works fine for the user account that's logged in, but not on others. So the problem is, if a program, for example, is running as an administrator and not as the local user, then that program can't see the mapped drive. And this can cause problems with things such as symlinks, etc. Now, to fix this, what we need to do in Windows is to enable linked network connections. Now, I've made a video about this in the past, one of the 2-minute tips videos, so I'm not going to go through that again now. But if you want to watch it, then please watch that video here. Okay, before we wrap this video up, there's just a couple of things I'm going to talk about before I go. So again, let's head over to the Unraid server, and let's go to Settings, and then SMB. Now, the first thing I'm going to talk about is the local master, and by default local master is set to yes. And you can see here the explanation of what local master is if this is set to yes, then the server will fully participate in browser elections, and in the absence of other servers will usually become the local master browser. So the first thing to notice here is in the absence of other servers. So that means if you have another Unraid server in the network, then only set one of them to be local master, and you normally want the one to be local master that's on all of the time. So what is this master browser? Well, since we've only got a work group here and there's no domain server, there's no one computer that keeps track of all the machines that are active on the network. So that's why we have a master browser. And so what happens is all of the computers on the LAN, they hold an election. And from this election, it selects a computer which becomes the master browser. And once the master browser is decided, it will be that machine that keeps a list of all the machines that are connected to the LAN. So obviously it's best to have the Unraid server be that one, especially as for most of us, our servers are on 24 hours a day. So because this is my backup server, I don't want this to ever become the local master. So I need to change this to no, but I need to stop the array in order to make those changes. Okay, so with that done, let me take you over to my main server. And here I'm going to go back to the SMB settings and scroll right down to the bottom, and you can see here I've got a bit here that says current elected master, and it says Prime is the current local master browser. Now the reason I can see this here on this server is because I installed a plugin called Local Master Browser. So if you install this plugin, as well as telling you which machine is the local master browser, it will also attempt to keep your Unraid server always elected as the local master browser. So it's well worth installing this plugin. Okay, so just to finish off, we're going to look at the SMB extras file. And to do that, we're going to go back across to my backup server, and we're going to go to Settings and SMB. And here you can see there's a part called SMB extras, but the array's got to be stopped in order for us to make any changes to this file. So let's stop the array now. And now you can see in the SMB settings that we're able to change these various things. So one thing we can do here is we can hide dot files. So any file with a dot before it, which are normally hidden files, we can hide them from being able to be seen when we're browsing the shares. So I'm going to set this to yes and click apply. So one example of things we can add to the SMB extras file is you see here that I've hidden the dot files. Well, also you can hide other files as well. So I'm going to put in here hide files equals, and then I don't want the file desktop ini to be visible in my shares, and also I don't want the file recycle bin to be there. Now the reason I'm putting these in is because in Windows I map my documents folder across to the share on Unraid, and so I don't want these files to be visible when I look at it from another machine. So basically anything you put here in hide files So anything you put here, so in the SMB extra configuration, if you put hide space files space equals, then space / and I've put desktop INI in here. That could be any file name or file type you don't want to be shown. And then if you want another file type, you put another / and then what you want after that. So basically the hide files equals stops us from being able to see certain files when we're browsing through shares. Now instead of using the hide files equals, if we were to use veto files equals, that would stop those type of files being created at all. Now I don't normally use that with Windows shares, but I do use it with OS X, and we'll be looking at that more in part 2. Now another really useful thing we can do with the SMB extras is we can create our own custom shares. Now I like to have a custom share from which I can access all of the shares on the Unraid server from one share. It's basically a top level share with all of the shares underneath it. I call this a root share. Now I've made a video before about how to connect to a root share, and if you want to watch that video then you can see that here. But what I'm going to do now is create my own custom share, which is going to be inside of another share on the server. So the first thing I'm going to do here is define the name of the share. So we put the name of the share inside of square brackets. So I'm going to call my share music and close the square brackets. And next I need to define the path of where this share is. So I'm going to type path space equals space / mnt / user / media and then / music and enter. Now the next line I'm going to type comment space equals, and you don't need to put this here, but I'm just going to put a comment for my own use, music inside media share. And on this line I'm going to type browsable space equals, and now this is whether the share is browsable on the network. I'm going to put yes and enter, and next I'm going to type public space equals space, and I don't want this to be a public share, I only want it to be a private share, so I'm going to put no and enter. And then on the next line I need to specify the users which can access this share, so I'm going to type valid space users space equals space ed and enter. Now next I'm going to define whether this share is writable, so I'm going to type writable space equals space yes and enter. And lastly I'm just going to type VFS space objects space equals and enter. So now I'm going to click apply and done. And because I've made a change to the SMB, I need to start up the array in order for that to take effect. And if I go to my shares here and to the media share, it's this folder here I've mapped a share directly to. So let's minimize this and go to this PC, and I'm going to click on map network drive, and I'm going to put in the IP address of the server and then / music and click finish. And now you can see I've opened the share directly into that folder, and you can see I can create folders here, so it's writable. And if we go back to the Unraid server, now if we look in this music folder here, we can see there's the folder that I just created. So guys, that brings us to the end of this video. If you use Mac OS, then look out for the next part. Now if you like this video, then please hit up the like button, and if you haven't subscribed to the channel, then please subscribe. And I just want to give a really big thanks to all of my patrons and supporters out there. It's you guys that really does make this possible for me to make these videos, and I can't thank you enough. Anyway guys, it's time for me to go now, so whatever you're up to for the rest of the day, I hope it's good, and I'll catch you in the next video.